We would start the recording now on our webinar on why and how you should take action against airline advertising, but also against sponsorship and greenwashing. So we have people here that will share a bit of an input. For the first half an hour. We will focus on sharing with you the reasons on why we should take action and keep taking action before we talk about how to do this. And Anna, who just quickly spoke, is kind enough to be our tech host today, but will also share experiences on the problem with greenwashing in the aviation industry later. And we also have Hannah here, also from Stay Grounded, who will talk about the Action Week that just took place and what happened there, and share some exciting news with us. And Robbie is also here from Badvertising, who has also been heavily involved in the Action Week and who also knows a lot about the aviation, the airline advertising industry. That's what I wanted to say, and will also share a bit without it. So, so if you haven't done so, feel free to also share in the chat your name and where you're coming from. And we will have, as I said, first a small input session on the topic itself, and then we will inform you and hopefully motivate you to also get engaged. And we will, if you want to raise a concern or a question later, we can also discuss later using the chat, or you can use the hand sign, of course, also. And today I will try to guide us through this webinar. My name is Sarah. I'm an action coordinator at Stay Grounded. I use the pronouns she or they, and we'll try to facilitate this meeting or this webinar of an hour or so. So Robbie, I think I would give the word to you first to talk about why or what's the problem with aviation advertising. And I am controlling the slides, so maybe just let me know so I can switch to the next one whenever you want to go to the next one.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much, Sarah. Hi everyone, my name is Robbie Gilliott from Ad Free Cities and the Badvertising campaign, which is a campaign against advertising for high carbon products, including airlines and airports. Next slide, Sarah, please. I'll just say next. So I'm just going to talk for 5 minutes or so about general problems with fossil ads, or as we call it, advertising for high carbon products. So we might include in that advertising by fossil fuel companies like Total, Shell, BP, airlines, airports, as well as petrol, diesel, and hybrid cars. And so the precedent for this campaign against advertising for those products is the campaign against tobacco advertising, which from around 2003 in Europe, after many years of campaigning, like decades of campaigning, a ban was introduced in different countries at different times. But around 2003, there was bans in the UK, there's bans from the European Union as well on tobacco advertising, with some exceptions. I think Germany only very recently banned cigarette advertising. But we can see here in the bottom left of this screen, these absolutely crazy to think now, adverts say more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. So using medical professionals in tobacco advertising seems laughable and crazy now, right? And I suppose the precedent we want to draw is to say, well, we are in the middle of a climate crisis, and sometimes we open a newspaper and it says, world scientists warn of dire climate threat. And then next to it, there's like, carry on flying, buy this big SUV vehicle. And so we want to address that contradiction. So next slide, please, Sarah. So in brief, some of the effects of fossil advertising, the climate effects is to normalize and promote high carbon lifestyles. and driving demand for products where and consumption of products that might not have existed before. Um, and in doing so, normalizes the ongoing use of high carbon lifestyles. Some of the health effects include air pollution, and also the mental health effects of climate change on young people. Um, and the psychological effects of advertising for high carbon products is a moral disengagement that people are like, well, this can't be that serious a problem. Otherwise, why is the whole world telling me to carry on as normal? Sarah, next slide, please. And so in the last few years, there's been some high institutional support for bans on high carbon advertising. So the IPCC has said that 40 to 70% of necessary emissions reductions can be reached through government by sparking fast behavior change programs, so including regulating fossil advertising. And more recently, various Dutch scientific organisations and British House of Lords Parliament, one part of the UK Parliament, recommended regulation of high carbon advertising and environmentally damaging products as well. So there's beginning to be institutional support for the demands that were part of this week of action that we've just done. Next slide, please. And if you want to see where some of these successes are starting to build at a local level, we have a lot of cities that are starting to implement bans on high carbon advertising, including Amsterdam, Stockholm, Sheffield in England, actually Sydney in Australia as well. So there's a website, worldwithoutfossilads.org, which shows a lot of these wins. There's also cultural institutions, arts galleries and film museums that are no longer taking sponsorship money from high carbon companies like airlines and fossil fuel companies. So this website, worldwithoutfossilads.org, really worth checking out to see some of the successes and to build that social momentum. The next slide, please, Sarah. And there's just it's got some nice graphics on it as well. We'll jump to the next slide. So we talked a bit about advertising, but its close relative is the sponsorship. Jump to the next slide, Sarah. So we're seeing a lot of airlines sponsor a lot of high carbon companies, car companies, fossil fuel companies, and airlines sponsor some of our favorite sports teams and sports competitions. I've borrowed these slides from my colleague Freddie Daly in the advertising campaign. If you jump to the next slide, Sarah. You can see here some of the airlines that are sponsoring, well, certainly a lot of British football teams. At the bottom right, we've got British Airways and Brighton, got Etihad Airways and Manchester City, Emirates and Arsenal Football Club, and Riyadh Airways, which I think hasn't actually begun flying yet, but they are just doing promotion and sponsorship first with their sponsorship of a local football club. Jump to the next slide. And we also see like that stadiums, sports stadiums are being used for greenwash opportunities. So we see here, Etihad says net zero emissions by 2050. And there's no credible plan for that from Etihad. And on the top right, Qatar Airways, fly greener, it says. And there was nothing behind that claim, it just said fly greener. On the bottom left, you can see a deal between Manchester City fans and Etihad, and it said if you recycled your plastic bottles at the football match, you would be rewarded with air miles. So stay blue by going green, it says. So these are some of the examples of greenwash exercises we see from airlines in the sports world. Next slide, please, Sarah. So three things, sort of a few factors of why sport is so valuable. On this graph, you can see the most trusted advertising channels. And the third and fourth one down, brand sponsorships in sporting events and brand sponsorships in general. You can see that 81% of respondents trust brand sponsorships in sporting events. That's a very high level of trust. So it's a big brands, big polluters know this, and that's why they are using sport to build that trust for the reach of millions of fans and sports participants. and to normalize their social license to operate, and to build soft power, especially for airlines looking to build their international reputation and the international reputation of their host countries, such as Etihad Airways or Qatar Airways. Use sponsoring popular football clubs or sports tournaments is one way of building soft power. Yeah, next slide, please, Sarah. I think that's everything. I will just, I think, jump to the next slide and I think hand over to Anne to present. So Anne, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I would just quickly talk a bit about the problem with greenwashing. Why? Because in most of the advertisements, or greenwashing in aviation specifically, because most of the advertisements we see at the moment, or many of them, are about, as Robbie just pointed out, related to sustainability claims of airlines. And so it's good to know what's behind those claims to debunk them. Next slide. So it's the aviation industry often talks about ways to get to sustainable aviation, to sustainable flights. And they're in general, we can say there are like 3 pillars of greenwash in aviation. Next slide. The first one is efficiency improvements. The second one is electric flight. The third one is so-called sustainable aviation fuels. And the fourth one is carbon offsetting. There are variants of this, of course, but this could be like 4 pillars that are very often mentioned. And for aircraft efficiency, the problem is that, yes, there are improvements in efficiency and technology, but they're outweighed by the growth of aviation. So emissions are still rising, even though there are efficiency improvements. Next. Yeah, we see that historically improvements have always been outweighed by the growth. Then for electric flight, can you go to the next? Yeah, the problem is that batteries are still much too heavy, so they're only viable for small aircraft flying very short distances, and those you could actually in most cases replace by ground transport. And also, it's actually not the most efficient use of our precious renewable energy. Next slide. Then there are different kinds of alternative fuels or fossil fuel substitute, what is called sustainable aviation fuels by the industry. One of this is biofuels or agrofuels, as we sometimes call them. They're crop-based agrofuels which compete with food production and also in many cases produce much more emissions actually than even fossil diesel or fossil kerosene. So here we have to be super careful. Then next slide. And then at the moment there's a big hype around fuel from waste, but also here we have a lot of problems attached because first of all, next slide. First of all, there is just not enough waste available, and also most of the waste is already used. Most of the biomass that the aviation industry wants to use for this waste-based fuels is already used in other sectors and can be used much more efficiently there. So the question is again, do we want to put this precious resource, this biomass, into aviation, which is actually a luxury product for a minority of people? Next slide. So the summary around biofuels is that for agricultural crops, they can be scaled sustainable and also fuel land grabbing and are a threat to water resources. And for waste, they can't be scaled and they are used and should be used for more essential sectors than aviation. Next slide. Then there are the so-called e-fuels, electrofuels, or synthetic kerosene. And here the biggest problem in our opinion is that the two biggest problems is there are no facilities yet proven at scale that actually produce this, and it will take decades to really produce synthetic e-fuel, so it can never be an excuse to not scale down aviation. And the other problem is that it really requires a huge amount of renewable energy, while at the moment we haven't decarbonized the grid yet. And there are a lot of different ways to use this precious renewable energy that we need to scale up elsewhere and use it also more efficiently. So here we can see that when you have low carbon electricity, the worst thing you can do in terms of efficiency is produce synthetic jet fuel out of it. Next slide. And then finally, carbon offsetting. I think most of you are aware of that we have seen quite some research in the past years, and especially again last year by The Guardian and the German Zeit, that show that nearly all of the carbon offsetting certificates that are offered are actually very questionable in terms of whether they're actually reducing emissions, and they are subject to fraud in many cases. So carbon offsetting is just not working. And even if there were some emission reductions by certain projects, in most cases, it would still be a kind of neo-colonial approach, because in most cases the compensation projects are in the global south. So we're actually asking communities that are impacted mostly by the climate crisis and contributed least to it to offset our emissions so we can continue flying. And that's, generally not the way to go, I think. Next slide. And there were some very interesting developments around greenwashing in the past month, and one of it is the lawsuit against KLM Airline, also by Fossil Free Netherlands, and that was actually won, and here KLM was lost their case. And the court was saying that their greenwashing, that they put misleading greenwashing claims, and one main subject of this was their claims that they can compensate emissions, and another one was actually challenging even the term sustainable aviation fuels, because the court said that sustainable here is not really, the sustainability is not proven. There are not enough information about what is actually sustainable, and the term sustainable aviation fuels is used very widely and in many cases not for something that's actually sustainable. So this is very important for us, I think, because it means also we have to take care not to reproduce this term. And it also offers an option for us, because what Fossil Free and Client Earth want to do now is challenging the airlines and saying, see here, we have this ruling that says you cannot do that. If you ever do that again, we will again go to court. And so all of us in our groups, we can help with that and look out for misleading greenwash, and then team up with organizations like Client Earth to sue the airlines for their misleading greenwashing claims. Next slide. So actually all of those pillars are not really contributing to sustainability in aviation. And for sure, they are not an excuse to drastically reduce aviation. And for sure, they're not something that we should accept in advertisements that even should bring people to fly more.
Thanks a lot, Anne, for sharing, and for also Robbie for taking us through the problems of aviation advertising and fossil advertising generally. but also sponsorship. So problems with with sports that we are facing, or not with sports generally, but with companies using sports and the trust that people put into that in the advertising there, and also the problems of greenwashings that are manifold, like many different strategies, and that we try to uncover and try to make sure not to reproduce also in the way we talk about aviation. And